Okay, let's see if, oh, this little bumblebee has more of an idea of how to get to the pollen. I wonder if it can get to the pollen from the back of the flower. Seems most unlikely, but it does seem to be what they're doing. I have seen, oh, here's another one. He's got bright orange pollen pockets. Can you see? Look at that. Can you see his pollen baskets? Oh, come on, land somewhere, Mr. Bee. Where's he gone? Right over there. Ooh. Let's see if there's another one. Here he is. Let's have a look at your pollen pockets. Oh, he's gone. Ooh, so still not. I have seen bees going right in these, but obviously not today for some reason. Not today. You gonna have a go? Lots of bees around. Go on, going underneath. Has he gone? No. Okay, we'll leave him to it. You can hear the buzzing. I think they've buzzed off to the next patch. Well, there's still one around. Is he over there? Can you spot him? Is it Mr. Bright Orange? Oh, here's one just here. I think they must be able to get to the flowers from the top. Get to the pollen and the nectar. Amazing. Okay, so what we were watching there, or trying to watch there, it's quite difficult to film bumblebees, was the bees doing a very important thing for themselves, collecting pollen and nectar. The pollen they take back to the nest and they store in the honeycomb to feed the young, the larvae, as they emerge from eggs. But then that was the pollen. The nectar they take back in their honey stomach, and they're going to make that into honey when they get back to the hive. But the most incredible thing about this, children, and it's one of the reasons and the most important reason that bees are so important, is because of the relationship that them doing that has with plants and then the food that we eat. Because of course, whilst the bee is visiting and collecting nectar and pollen, it's doing a very, very important job. It is pollinating the flowers. Now, if I just tell you that without bees, then there would not be any of these foods. Have a little think about these. All of these fruit, vegetables, various things, they're all produced because flowers have been pollinated by bees. So when we get worried about the bees reducing, the number of bees reducing, we get worried because that might mean that fewer of these fruits and vegetables, which is so important to our diet as humans, wouldn't be produced. Not only that, but so much of the food that we also give to animals that we eat is also produced because flowers have been pollinated. Because all of these fruit and veg come from a plant, come from flowers which have been pollinated by bees so that they could therefore produce fruit. So a bit like my pear tree at the bottom of the garden, that only works because the flowers were pollinated by bees, which means it could set fruit. So we know a little bit, don't we now, about how they do that. These are some of the bees' favourite types of flowers to go to. They love bright flowers and strongly scented flowers, and I try to keep a little bit of our garden wild because they tend to like the wild type of flowers that sometimes look a little bit like weeds or might be weeds, but the bees absolutely love them. So you might have seen on the video there were some wild creeping buttercups, which I try to keep because the bees really like those as well. So what actually happens when the bee visits the flower? How do they do that important job? First of all, for them to collect the nectar and the pollen, but also for the flower, because it's the bee that creates the new seeds that can become a new life of a new flower. Okay, so I'll read you this and then I'll show you the picture again. All about pollination. The process of pollen moving from one flower to another is called pollination. So the pollen has to move from one flower to another. And we could see, couldn't we, that the bees were moving from one flower to another and taking the pollen to another flower. Flowers need pollination to make seeds. Reproduction is when these seeds grow into new plants. And I know year 5, because I was doing a bit of planning with Mrs. Scrimshaw, you're going to be learning all about this, all about pollination, and you're going to be dissecting a flower to have a look for all these parts that can create a new flower. But the flowers need help moving the pollen. Sometimes this help comes from the wind, and sometimes it comes from animals, especially bees. Bees are pollinators. They are one of the animals that are called pollinators because they move pollen from one flower to another, which then helps to create a new flower. How do bees pollinate plants? Well, I think we probably know some of this already. Number 1, a bee is attracted to a flower because of its bright petals and sweet smell. So flowers are very clever. They've evolved over time to be very beautiful and to smell very sweetly, so the bees are attracted to them. The bee enters the flower, or tries to enter the flower in the case of our bumblebee, to collect nectar and pollen. Pollen comes off the stamen part of the flower, and you could probably see that. I wonder actually, I'll just go and collect one of the Aquilegia flower heads. I'll be right back, just bear with me. I'm back again. Yes, so what we were saying is that the pollen comes off the stamen part of the flower, which are the male parts of the flower. And I don't know whether you can see, if it'll just focus in on that you can see the yellow colour there. This Aquilegia has got lots of little stamen, and each one of them is covered with pollen. All this yellow is pollen. It's come off on my finger a little bit there. Don't know whether you can see that. So as the bee travels into the flower, this is why I was saying it's no good trying to get to the top of the flower, bees. You need to get in to get the pollen on your legs and into your pollen sacs. So the bee collects the pollen, first of all. And after visiting the flower, the bee's back and legs and fluffy body are covered in pollen. So it ends up with this yellow pollen all over its hairy, fluffy body. And of course, what does it do then? It then goes to travel to another flower, and that's where the magic happens, because pollen has to get from one flower to another flower to create a new flower to reproduce. The bee then visits another flower to collect even more pollen and nectar, and at the next flower, the pollen falls off the bee's body and gets stuck on the sticky part of the flower, the female part, which is called the stigma. Now, you can't really see the stigma too well in here, but it's right in the middle of all of those stamen. And that's when the magic happens, because if the pollen gets onto the female part, the stigma, it can then travel down the stigma and fertilize the eggs at the bottom of it. The pollen enters the flower at the stigma and grows a tube to the ovary. Here it meets the egg. After the pollen has joined with the egg starts to become a seed, and the seed can then grow into a new plant. So does that make sense? I'll just show you the picture. So the bee visits flower number 1 and gets its whole body covered in pollen from the stamen. The pollen, the yellow pollen on the end of the stamen. It then, of course, wants to collect more pollen and nectar, so it travels to another plant, such as this one, another flower. And this time the pollen that is collected from the first flower gets rubbed off whilst it's collecting more in the flower. And if we're really lucky, it will get rubbed off into the stigma, which is the central part of the flower. And this is the stigma here. And then the pollen can travel down to the seed, to the egg in the female part of the flower. and fertilise that egg, and that egg becomes a new seed. So you can see there how bees are absolutely essential to the reproduction of flowers. And without flowers, we don't have fruit. Remember I was showing you the pears? You've got to have the flowers first before you can get the fruit. And that's why we get very, very worried when we hear about bee numbers reducing, because all of these and many, many, many more wouldn't be available for us to eat. And you won't believe this, children, but there are some places in the world where bee numbers have reduced so much that they are having to do their own pollination because there are not enough bees. And there's a picture here of them doing it. So basically what they're doing, people are trying to pretend to be bees, not dressing up in yellow and black, but they're going up into the trees and brushing pollen from one flower to another to try to make sure that the flowers are pollinated, because there aren't enough bees to do the job. Goodness me. Whew. So there we are. We've learned something really important there, haven't we? That relationship between what the bees do to collect the things that they want and our food, the food on our table. And if it wasn't for bees, then we wouldn't have pollinated flowers. And if it wasn't for pollinated flowers, then we wouldn't have fruit, and we wouldn't have more flowers, and we wouldn't have more plants. And then our diet, the things that are available to eat, would be dramatically changed and reduced. Wow. So there we go. That was an important bit of learning. Let's hope, for the sake of pollination, that my bumblebees figure out how to get into, not the bottom of this part of the aquilegia, because I can't see, there's no pollen there, because they hang like this. They've got to figure out, they've got to buzz down and then go up to get to that lovely pollen. So I'll go out a bit later and see if they've worked it out. I'm sure they will. They're very clever. Okay, there we go. The importance of bees. Never underestimate it. Have a lovely Wednesday, everybody. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.